basically the people running the show here and that that Epstein was fronting for. It's intelligence and organized crime, but it's a symbiosis of those two entities that has become so interconnected. They are one and the same, and these are basically the people that are running most governments in the world today.
Who actually was Jeffrey Epstein? I mean, who really was he? Was he just a sex trafficker? Was there more to him? What is hidden in the underbelly of this story that hasn't been totally revealed to the masses yet? Well, Whitney Webb gets to the root of that question and answers in a way that we have to understand and appreciate because she's the author of, in my estimation, the very best book on Epstein. So let's see what she has to say. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
Now, in a sentence or two, summarize for us, who was Jeffrey Epstein? Who was he working for? What was he doing?
Okay, Jeffrey Epstein was as much a financial criminal as a sex criminal. There's a very particular reason why mainstream media only wants to talk about his sex crimes between 2000 and 2006. Jeffrey Epstein was also not an anomaly in the network in which he operated. Numerous people engaged in sex blackmail and sex trafficking. If you think these issues died with Jeffrey Epstein, you were sorely mistaken. But one of the reasons Jeffrey Epstein is really important is because a lot of the situation in which we find ourselves, whether it's impending economic collapse, transhumanism, all sorts of this stuff, he had his hands in those pies and a lot more. And if you were to pull on the Epstein thread, I guess you could say, you start to unravel a lot of the bigger picture, and a lot of what is going on right now has its origins decades ago. And basically the people running the show here and that that Epstein was fronting for. It's intelligence and organized crime, but it's a symbiosis of those two entities that has become so interconnected. They are one and the same, and these are basically the people that are running most governments in the world today.
And again, you demonstrate that throughout the book. The entire book, essentially, is that thesis just over and over and over and over again through all of these people. And everyone who's even mentioned in passing gets a couple of paragraphs about their operation and how that tied into this, and then into another company, and this was tied into that, which we already talked about back several chapters ago, and then this ties into this. It's... Again, until you really read through this, you don't get the sense of how this operates. But once you do, you start to realize that, yes, Jeffrey Epstein might have been a spider in this web, but just one of many, and this was a very, very vast web.
Absolutely. I think that's a perfect way to put it. Actually, that's Whitney Webb's best insight about the Epstein case and Epstein himself, if you ask me, that he was just as involved in money laundering schemes as he was in sex trafficking and sexual exploitation. Certainly so, yet that aspect gets totally hidden. And we know that from his days, even as early as Bear Stearns, when he worked to launder money and to evade taxes for rich clients that he represented, including the Bronfman family, the owners of the Seagram's empire in Canada, and from there forward. And it was just after he left Bear Stearns that he was somehow finding himself on a private jet with Doug Leese, an arms trafficker, flying to the Pentagon for reasons unknown. It seems like about that time he got involved in this deep, dark, deep state web that was involved in many things like arms trafficking operations, most famously like Iran-Contra, where arms were given to the Israeli government and then from the Israeli government passed to the Iranians at the end of the Iraq-Iran war. And this was done under wraps through clandestine policy that was illegal by law because law prevented this exchange from happening. So there was operations on the Israeli side of this done by none other than Adnan Khashoggi, one of his famous clients, a Saudi playboy that became kind of an archetypal example of the rich Saudi, the rich Saudi personality that became a caricature, essentially.
Yeah, and it's a web that continues to exist right now and impact our lives a lot right now, and it definitely, deserves to be talked about. And some people may be thinking, well, 900 pages is a lot, and like, yes, I understand that, but you have to understand too, the reason it got so long, I think, is because the thesis is very complicated, and the thesis is complicated to prove because they've made it complicated to prove, if you don't have an airtight case for this kind of stuff, I'm going to be opening myself up to a lot of smears. Oh, this conspiracy theorist saying the stuff, we can't take it seriously. So you have to go back in the history to show that the same people do the same crimes, have the same rackets, decade over decade over decade over decade. And there's continuity between the crimes of the CIA and the mob and all that stuff of yesteryear, basically to now, and that it hasn't stopped. And this idea that organized crime disappeared and like sexual blackmail, that's not a thing in the US. It's been a thing since like the 40s and the 50s, and it's never really stopped. And our government clearly does not operate the way we are told it is.
Certainly so, and the forces behind who actually controls the government is not who the government says they are. The government's standard narrative is that Congress and the president and the federal judiciary controls politics in the United States, but the truth is, it's this deep state underbelly run by the intelligence services and the regulatory regime that creates policies for all of us and covers up the most heinous crimes. What was MK Ultra? It was an attempt to control the minds of people in the United States. Psychological operations to support wars against foreign countries, led by the CIA. Operation Mockingbird, the CIA's attempt to influence news media in the United States to make it more compliant toward federal policy in terms of empire building schemes and wealth transfer schemes. That is what we get. Epstein was just a part of it, and every element related to Epstein in that is kind of kept under wraps. Even in mainstream journalistic articles talking about Epstein, it really only focuses on his sex crimes, and that's really important. But there's a whole other side to Epstein that Whitney Webb reveals in her excellent book, One Nation Under Blackmail. The second volume talks about Epstein. It's so highly recommended. It's where I learned most of what I know about Epstein, and she really lays out a thesis that I think is impossible to disprove.
And, there's basically the conversation that needs to be had after reading this book is the government, the CIA, all of these people here and their networks need to be investigated, but the government isn't capable of investigating itself. So what do we do, right? What do you do in that situation?
That is the question, isn't it?
But organized crime is in charge. You know, that's ultimately, what we're dealing with here. And that's why I thought it was important to go back to sort of the origins of the CIA and how this all sort of started, because you see from the very beginning who was really behind the OSS and the CIA and all of that.
Yes, the intelligence agencies are organized crime. They're just the most organized of the organized crime, perhaps.
Well, that's the biggest truth that's ever been told, right? It is organized crime, and Whitney Webb is absolutely accurate here, talking about the origins of the OSS. Who is the architect of the OSS? That's the precursor to the CIA, by the way. There's a guy named Duncan Lee, a guy that's categorically proven to have been a Soviet agent. The Venona Project disclosed this because of decrypted Soviet cables. We learned that he was on the take from Moscow. And then who built the CIA, the modern CIA, into what it was? That's Allen Dulles. He orchestrated regime change operations in Guatemala, Iran, in the Bay of Pigs fiasco, and his influence was felt in trying to conduct Operation Northwoods, an actual attempt to conduct a false flag attack by killing Americans and using that as an excuse to topple the Cuban regime after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion. So this really is organized crime. Epstein was probably part of that world, if not in the United States, in Israel. That's where most of the connections lie. And we know that because of excellent reporting from Ryan Grimm and Murtaza Hussein. I've talked about a lot of those connections in previous videos, but they have made 6 ironclad connections between Epstein and Israel, literally working on behalf of Israel just in the last month. That's just from disclosures that have happened since then. Not anything that is going to come out, if it does, in this Epstein files release, which will be redacted and classified. Let's just be real.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of these arrests over time of, they took down these mob guys, they took down these narco traffickers or, people like that. It's consolidation. They're taking out their competition. Yeah, so basically, this is born out of my effort that originally started when I worked at Mint Press News to figure out the intelligence connections of Jeffrey Epstein after, as probably a lot of your viewers are aware, Alex Acosta, then Secretary of Labor under Trump, had previously been an attorney, I think U.S. Attorney of Florida or something like that, and had to sign off on what is known as Epstein's sweetheart deal during his first arrest. And he told the Trump transition team, in trying to get that position of Secretary for Labor, that he'd been told that Epstein had belonged to intelligence and to leave him alone. He's above his pay grade, and to just sign off on the thing, right?
That's something a lot of people don't know, but Alex Acosta, the attorney for the United States, said that. It's part of the documented record. He told that to the Trump transition team that was entertaining the prospect of hiring him as the labor secretary. Guess what they did? Exactly that. Hired him as the labor secretary despite this debacle and despite the fact that he had given the game away. He was told that Epstein was intelligence. And then we're just supposed to not, remember that or just not care about that. He's since denied that's what he said, but it's part of the documented record.
So, what were those intelligence ties? Which intelligence agencies? Or was it multiple agencies? Was he an asset? Was he an agent? What was he doing for intelligence? So that whole effort took me, it took a while to unpack, and you really have to understand how intelligence works. I think a lot of people look at, the CIA or Mossad or MI5 or, whatever as sort of like monoliths, like they don't have these transnational connections or they don't have ties to other entities outside of themselves. And it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, you even have people, for example, taking the CIA as an example. You have people that, are disillusioned in the CIA, sort of making their own private CIA spinoffs that are like private intelligence agencies. You have oligarchs basically having their own intelligence agencies, like the Rockefeller family and stuff that gets talked about in the book to an extent. And so, it's definitely, in order to really understand what was going on with Epstein and the intelligence connections, you kind of have to understand the history of how these agencies developed, right? And how they interact with corporate power, with organized crime, with government, and like all other sorts of stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And Epstein had ties in all those worlds, in intelligence and business, in the bureaucracy, in the intelligence community. And I happen to believe that Epstein was more of a Robert Maxwell-like figure, and he was something of a protege to Robert Maxwell. That's the father of Ghislaine Maxwell. He was Israel's most prominent spy. Major books have been written about him. He died in mysterious circumstances himself. We won't get into that. But Epstein was probably an intelligence free agent of sort, meaning that I don't think he carried a badge as a Mossad employee, but he certainly was an asset of Mossad or some form of Israeli intelligence. We know that because of his work, from the security agreements he brokered between Israel and Mongolia and Israel and the Ivory Coast, from his bank transfers with one of Israel's most prominent spies, Yoni Koren, who stayed with him like Ehud Barak for prolonged periods of time. And Ehud Barak, what the hell is that? He was living with Epstein at his Manhattan mansion, the former head of IDF intelligence, and the former prime minister living with Epstein for prolonged periods. Epstein knew other prime ministers of Israel, including Ehud Olmert, who still, is something of a political force there. There's just too many connections to ignore, but I don't think that he was directly working as an employee. He might have worked for the CIA too as an asset. I don't know. I think he was a free agent doing work for a lot of people. Just the most ironclad connections we found have been toward Israel. The one country we're not allowed to talk about Epstein's connections to, but that is the truth.
Well, for people who are interested in that aspect of intelligence, there is no lack of information in here. So taking a page from your book, metaphorically or literally, why don't, instead of going straight into, okay, so who was Epstein and who was he working for? Why don't we back into this from some of the... Because I think of this sort of in the same way that I approached the Who is Bill Gates documentary. It's ostensibly about Bill Gates, but it's really about all of the different connections and the things that he's investing in, and you sort of use that to go out on the spokes to see the different web of things that are involved here. And I think similarly with this, it's, I guess, about Epstein, but it's about much, much more than Epstein. So let's play a little game then, I guess. Word association. Let's talk about some of the characters that appear in this work and how they are associated with this story. And one that I wanted to start with, because it's an interesting name, and one that will be familiar even to Joe Q normies in the audience, the name of Khashoggi. Of course, most people are thinking of Jamal Khashoggi because, of course, he's been in the news for the past few years, or his death has been in the news for the past few years. But no, we're talking about Khashoggi's uncle, Adnan Khashoggi, who definitely makes an appearance in this book. Tell us about Adnan Khashoggi and his connection to this intelligence web that is being talked about here.
Sure. So before I get to that, though, really quickly, this is one of the reasons why Volume 1 ended up basically happening. You're writing about Jeffrey Epstein, and Adnan Khashoggi becomes one of his clients, for example, after he leaves Wall Street in Bear Stearns in the early 80s. And I was like, well, I guess, I think most people only really have a superficial understanding of Adnan Khashoggi. And not just that, but like Iran-Contra in general, or things like Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, or the savings and loan scandal, and all of this stuff. That in order to get the big picture and like really understand this period and what Epstein was doing there, you kind of have to know this history, right? So, in short, talking about someone like Adnan Khashoggi, most people think of him, if you know anything about him at least, as like a Saudi arms dealer. But really, he's a lot more than that. He had connections to pretty much every intelligence agency, and was involved. Was involved in creating the Safari Club, which was like sort of a conglomerate of different intelligence agencies, and all sorts of other things as well. He had a yacht that later gets sold to Donald Trump. But why, it's Khashoggi is using it. He basically has a group of women that, according to one woman that was in this group, they were used as sexual bait, basically for the purpose of sex blackmail. He had ties to like a sex blackmail ring. Based in Europe, run by a lady named Fortuna Israel, and all other sorts of, bits and bobs in his career. So you start to look at people like Adnan Khashoggi, people like Jeffrey Epstein stop looking like an anomaly. And a lot of the mainstream narrative about Epstein that people have been fed by the mainstream press is that, Epstein's an anomaly. He was the one bad billionaire, and now he's dead, so everything's fine. But really, you find out that history is littered with these people. And, more often than not, they're the people really involved with a lot of the, political scandals that we remember and hear about.
Yeah, absolutely true. He doesn't seem as much of an anomaly considering Adnan Khashoggi. Also, Jean-Luc Brunel, his compatriot that was a billionaire, went down for his associations with Epstein. The French authorities captured him, brought him to jail, and guess how he died? Death by hanging. Death by hanging also for Jean-Luc Brunel, another guy in this same camp. And these stories continue more and more. It's crazy because, again, this is a side of Epstein that so many people don't know. Soon after he left Bear Stearns in the 80s, he gets caught up in this deep state arms trafficking, money laundering web. And I think these arms traffickers wanted to help use him or get his skill set in place to conduct their operations and help them with that. He got associated with figures like Douglas Leese, the famous American arms trafficker, and a guy named Stephen Hoffenberg, who out of a business plan, conducted one of the biggest mass pyramid schemes in U.S. history, went down for it, actually spent 18 years in jail over it, and to his dying day said Jeffrey Epstein was actually the real architect of that. That's called the Towers financial scheme. Read about that if you don't believe me. Epstein was involved in that, and we know that Epstein acted as a federal informant in that case, giving the feds information on Hoffenmeyer's plan, his scheme. And for that, he received quasi-immunity. He never got prosecuted for this. And we're supposed to believe, again, there's no connections to intelligence there. We also know after his first conviction, eventually reaching that plea deal, the sweetheart deal that's so absurd in 2008, Epstein, as part of that, was supposed to provide the feds information on his criminal activities. We know that from documentation that actually exists in that case, which is very much hidden, but this document proves that. This is a document showing that. Right down here, you can see the highlighted area. Epstein's also provided information to the FBI as agreed upon. Case agent advised that no federal prosecution will occur in this manner as long as Epstein continues to uphold his agreement with the state of Florida. Part of that agreement was to give the feds information. Have we heard what that is? No. Are we likely to get that out of the Epstein files disclosures? I highly doubt that. But I really appreciate Whitney Webb. This was a great interview. Thank you, James. James is a great author in his own right. Really respect his trade too. But Whitney's book is so invaluable. So I really advise that you get One Nation Under Blackmail, especially version 2. It's just fantastic. And it's the best source of information overall on the Epstein case. But that said, what do you think? Do you think that Epstein was as much of an arms trafficker, a money launderer, as he was a sex fiend? Let me know in the comments down below, and frankly, a sex criminal. What is there to learn? What do we have? What have we not learned about Epstein yet? What's likely to come out of these disclosures? I don't know if we will find much out because a lot of it's going to be redacted. You have that meme going around where it's just a black block of text, and that's what we're going to get. Or redacted, classified documents instead. What do you think we're going to get? Let me know in the comments down below. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. Also subscribe to James Corbett Report. Great channel, great interview. Thank you, Whitney, for sitting down with Corbett. Also, if you like this video and my take, please consider becoming a YouTube member. You can do that by clicking the join button down below. And if you do that, you can help support the channel. And in return for that, I'll give you access to all my videos before they go live to the general public on YouTube. You'll be able to watch those members only videos right away. Also, if you want a free copy of my first book, Compact of the Republic, click the link in the description below. It'll shoot you out to a site. Plug in your email. I'll send that to you for free, no obligation, no cost, in PDF form, just because you rock. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, and no more empire. Peace out, guys. Catch you in the next one.